muito boa tarde a todos, sejam muito bem-vindos. Eu faço esta primeira apresentação, estas boas-vindas em português, depois passarei a falar em inglês, uma vez que todos os nossos participantes se vão exprimir em inglês. Quem precisar, existe tradução simultânea, portanto é só pedirem os dispositivos para poderem ter a tradução simultânea. Agora passo em inglês. So, hello, welcome. My name is Rita Fabiana, and I'm curator at CAM Gulbenkian. I'm also the head of live arts programming. First of all, I want to welcome you all and thank you for your presence here with us today in the first happening of the program Immaterial Ecologies, a 3-day program that will happen in Gulbenkian Building and Gardens between today and Sunday, always in the afternoon. Also a special thanks to Karen Udaget, Sauda Ismailova, Marie Bardet, and Michael Marder that accept with enthusiasm our invitation for the present conversation, that share their thoughts in the process, nourishing our own questioning and wills, and finally to be here today sharing with us all their research and practice, a common ground here and now for a broader discussion with you. We really hope that this conversation found your echoes, questions, doubts, wills. We would love to hear your questions after the presentations. This gathering, the participation of Cara, Sauda, Marie and Michael, but also of all the other participants today and in the 2 coming days, perform to us a kind of constellation of experience, ideas, practice, gestures, relations, formats that in many ways and in different ways approach a possible understanding or empathy about what immaterial ecologies may evoke, summon or call for. Other word than constellation could be atmosphere, the program being in a certain way an atmosphere that involves us or evolves us, made by presence and made with absence for those who are bodily absent, like Sun Ra, Lourdes de Castro or Anna Atterley. Because we believe that time, as we understand it in the Western culture, running to the future is a fiction, like other fictions. We like to believe that this gathering can intersect times. It's also very significant that Immaterial Ecologies program starts with the first panel of conversations. The project first born from an informal conversation between Alex Alonso Dias, in my left, and I, almost a year ago, a releasing moment that brings the will to thought together, a program about ecology that embrace other possible ways to approach ecologies behind their material meaning, combining and reconnecting with the spiritual and invisibilized dimensions that allowed us to reconnect with nature, to resynchronize land and bodies, and to imagine worlds otherwise. Ecologies has a large field that, in the line of Isabel Stengers, would bring together reflections and actions from feminism, queer studies, indigenous cultures and battles, decolonization, and many more. I thank Alex Alonso Dias for this marvelous journey, for this incredible openness to think together, and in a surprising ways, but also for a strong sense of sharing, always with a great enthusiasm. Thank you. This beautiful title, Immaterial Ecologies, was proposed by Alex, an abundant soil where ideas, experience, practice, and even ghosts could find a temporary home, perhaps a nomadic home. Alejandro Alonso Dias, the co-curator of Immaterial Ecologies, is a curator, a writer, and the director of Fluent, an artistic space located in Santander. I wanted also to thank the CAMS team, and in first the CAMS Live Arts team, Catarina Aristia and Sofia Mendes, that were very generous and show a strong commitment. The Live Arts team was created in 2021 within the new project project for CAM by Benjamin Weil, the director of CAM, and with Ana Botelha, the deputy director of CAM. I thank Benjamin and Hannah for their support. I also thank my colleagues Ana Teresa and Rita Romão, Maria Andrade and Lara Almeida, and all the other colleagues that made possible the program. Finally, thank you to the translators, but also the Portuguese Sign Language that are with us today too. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Rita, também pela cumplicidade e a generosidade para unir-nos às imaginações durante esses meses de trabalho. Eu também, como a Rita, gostaria de agradecer a todas as equipas da Fundação, muito especialmente a Catarina e a Sofia, sem as quais o programa não seria tido possível, por todo o seu trabalho ao longo do projeto e também ao resto das equipas também. E por último, muito especialmente a Benjamin e a Ana pelo convite para imaginar juntas novas linguagens e pensarem sobre a importância de abrir a ecologia para formas mais holísticas, mais porosas, mais relacionais. Agora vou mudar para o inglês para me comunicar com os participantes da conversa. So before introducing the conversation today, I would also like to introduce a little bit of immaterial ecologies and the broader project. And for that, I would like to remember a passage to which Marie Bardet introduced me. Marie will send a pre-recorded contribution because unfortunately she cannot be with us today. But she introduced me to, in her book, El cultivo de los gestos, or The Harvesting of Gestures, a passage in which she recalls when in 1962, the agricultural engineer André Audricourt formulated a strange and challenging hypothesis when he posed 3 questions that I'm going to read with you, and then in the contribution that Marie has sent, she will explore deeper. And the 3 questions go like this. What kind of impact did the gestures of agricultural cultivation and animal breeding have on the mentalities that gave birth to the world's metaphysics? What have to do the sheep? That was the first question. The second is, what have to do the sheep, the gestures of the shepherd, and the harvesting of wheat with the philosophies of transcendence? And the third says, aren't the jam and the rice, the buffalo and the cow entangled in a primitive gesture that enables the passage of metaphysics towards the philosophies of immanence? These questions, which might sound too abstract, perhaps, and I would like to ground, what introduce is a way of thinking, of producing, valuing, and doing politics that cannot be dissociated from the way of cultivating and making world or harvesting world, as perhaps Marie will say. There is no detachment here. There is no cut from earthly existence, or as Michael Marder puts it, when he formative agents. And in that sense, as Rita was saying in her introduction, it is important to also remember and count with the work of absence or bodily absent artists such as Sandra Lourdes Castro and Anna Atherley. So when we started gathering references and texts that deal with energy transition, the rise of green corporate departments and so on, which turn into a fluid, kind of fluid at times and more, sometimes by email, sometimes in person, but at all times a very speculative exchange between Rita and I that consider the immaterial dimensions of ecology, as well as issues of perception, implication, habitability, and dependence. And in order to deal with this question, we began to interrogate forms of political ecology and theoretical frameworks that address materiality as if it will be a singular and isolated condition, while seeking meanings and purposes for socially and ecologically engaged projects that address, and this will be unfolded throughout the duration of these 3 days, poetry and poiesis as healing forces. So considering a necessary or urgent gesture towards opening up these ontologies of ecology, as well as the current need for decrease of our economies, of our political structures, waste and consumption, the voices that we gather here through these now in this conversation, but also throughout these 3 days, investigate what are these immaterialities, which is itself a relative term, and I would like you to invite to think of immateriality as a relative term, and what agencies can be found when adopting this position. So through practices that differ widely, and this was a very conscious methodology in our curatorial process, both in terms of media format, but also in terms of geography and locality, the invited artists and contributors appear as a polyphonic and very sensual force, bringing notions and experiences of tenderness, resonance, temperature, as I invite you to see the film by Denis Ferreira da Silva in Auditorio 2, love, touch, and intimacy, in order to question the rationalist and materially reductionist models of ecology, as well as the formal aestheticization of the ecological in the arts, suggesting instead possible exchanges between different kinds of knowledge, whether these are subaltern, peasant, indigenous, queer, matriarchal, vegetal, and more. So I will now introduce the conversation today. So moving into this panel, which is a kind of overture, a kind of prelude, a prologue to the rest of the program. We are very excited to be joined by Cara New-Daggett, Saudade Ismailova, Michael Marder, and Marie Bardet to discuss what we have decided to title Inner Extractivism Within Spiritual, Embodied, and Energetic Entanglements. And for it, we put the question of energy at the center of the conversation, and we try to decolonize the term, not only by imagining alternative to fossil fuels, but also new ways of thinking, sensing, and inhabiting energy systems. So in that sense, and as Cara New-Daggett puts it in her book, The Birth of Energy, a shift in energy cultures and epistemologies will entail a thorough transformation of habits of energy production and consumption. So in the pursuit for these new epistemologies, through this conversation, we are bridging relations with other forms of understanding energy and to expand it towards a more bodily and spiritual dimensions. And for that, we come today with Marie Bardet, that will speak from the distance. Marie is a dancer and philosopher. She studied and worked between France and Argentina for some years, but she currently lives in Buenos Aires. Her thinking and practice brings together philosophy and dance, crossing the boundaries between moving and thinking. And she draws as much from improvisation and somatic practices as from Berson's work on feminism. And through this, she considers life running through bodies and politics, configuring common spaces of artistic multiplicity and situated thinking. In relation to the proposed conversation, Marie has written widely about gestuality and the traces of gestures as a fundamental aspect of interdependency and relationality, as for instance in the books Pensar con Mover, Thinking as Moving, El cultivo de los gestos, The harvesting of gestures, or Hacer con gestos, making work with gestures. Also today with us is Cara New-Daggett, who works in the field of political science, where she makes research on feminist political ecology. Her path to feminism and environmental politics began after studying biochemistry and medicine, hoping to address inequalities in health outcomes, when she became more interested in the how and why behind injustice, and switched course to embark upon postgraduate work in global politics. Her genealogical approach to energy in The Birth of Energy unveils the deep political implication of this term-born concept, showing how entangled energy is to power and work in today's fossil fuel imaginaries, and why an energy transition is not just as simple as switching fuel types. Today we'll also speak Saudade Ismailova, who's a filmmaker and artist who came of age in the post-Soviet era and has established artistic lives between Paris and Tashkent while remaining deeply engaged with her native region. Among many other projects, there is one of particular interest within the context of this conversation and the broader program of immaterial ecologies, which is a research group called DAVRA that you presented at Documenta 15 this year. And DAVRA which was established by Ismailova in Tashkent in 2021, was dedicated to studying, documenting, and disseminating Central Asian cultures and knowledge, and to investigating the figure of the Chiltan, which is a spirit. Well, it's quite a complex term that you will probably explain better than me. And finally, Michael Marder, who is a philosopher whose work spans the fields of environmental philosophy and ecological thought, political theory, and phenomenology. His work has focused on cultivating philosophies that consider and derive from vegetal life, proposing new models for understanding the complex relationships between humans and the apparent inertia of plants. Departing from this body of research, his work has also paid attention to some fundamental questions within today's conversation, as, for example, the notion of energy. In 2017, he published Energy Dreams of Actuality with Columbia Press, Dust, as in his 2016 book Dust with Bloomsbury, or the connections between theology and ecology, as expressed in Green Mass, the ecological theology of St. Hildegard of Bingen. So thank you very much, everyone, and now I will leave it to you, Cara.
It's just on? Yes. Okay. Hi, everyone. I have some pictures. Are they going to be? Oh, great. Okay. Oh, yeah, maybe I'll go up there.
You don't have your hands.
First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to be part of this curated conversation. I cross fields between politics and climate policymakers, and a lot of times talk to engineers. And I have to say that I think the arts and humanities are having the most interesting conversations when it comes to ecological politics and climate change. So it's a real pleasure to be in the room with a lot of artists and humanities thinkers. This event invited me and us to think about immateriality, which is certainly relevant to energy, which is not actually a material thing at all. In physics, energy is about the arrangement of things, of molecules. So it tells us about the capacity for any arrangement to do work, especially in engineering terms, and how that capacity changes over time. So energy is actually very mathematical. It's a set of calculations that tell us something about the world. And in that sense, it's more of an epistemology, or a way of understanding the world, than it is an ontology or thing itself. Although I still think energy is curiously material, but perhaps we'll come to that. So lest you think this is a misguided political theory person, I wanted to share this quote from Richard Feynman, who's a physicist in the middle of the 20th century, and he was teaching at Caltech, and he says, "Physics has no knowledge of what energy is. We don't have a picture that it comes in little blobs of a definite amount. However, there are formulas, and when we all add it all together, it gives us the same number." So you can see here the immateriality, I suppose you could say, of energy. Nevertheless, so I'm talking about the physics of energy, but energy has been and remains a very capacious and weird concept, touching upon life force and change in the cosmos, and it's always been wrapped up with human spirituality and morality, philosophy. We see it in New Age movements, climate politics, So what I was interested in is how this capacious term becomes so narrow in meaning when it enters politics. And it really, when we say energy politics, we're not talking about gravity or how well I slept last night. We're talking about fuel, and often fossil fuels. So I'm interested in the politics of fuel and what the word energy does when we use it to mean fuel in politics. And this was the question that drove this book I wrote, The Birth of Energy, pointing out that energy is a very modern notion, the way we understand it today. It comes out of the 19th century science of energy. So in that sense, it's a very modern scientific term, unlike terms like matter or force, which have much older histories. Before that, the term energy was more of a poetic and philosophical word, not very commonly used, tied to Aristotle's original energeia, which I imagine maybe Michael will tell us more about. So what I learned from this history is that the 19th century science of energy, when energy is supposedly discovered, is called thermodynamics, and it had a very important political and economic context. Modern Western energy was born in large part through the desire to make steam engines more efficient. To notice this historical context is not to say that science is wrong or thermodynamics is wrong. And I think in a lot of debates we have about science, there is this fear that if you historicize it or contextualize it, you're somehow undermining it. What it means is that this is one way of knowing energy. And perhaps it's useful in certain concepts, like making a steam engine work better. But it's only one way of knowing about change in the world, and part of my argument is that it has come to dominate all of the many ways that especially the modern West thinks about energy, and especially about fuel. So thermodynamics tells us that energy is conserved across changes, but even in this very first sort of basic conservation law, we already have a fiction because ultimately there are known closed systems, and energy is only conserved in a closed system, meaning a system in which energy neither is entering or leaving. No one knows if the cosmos is an open or closed system, or maybe it bends back on itself like a Mobius strip. And I wanted to point out that energy is still a really weird thing in physics. So now there's this thing called dark energy, which supposedly makes up more than 60% of the known content of everything that exists. But actually, again, you might notice how similar this quote is to Feynman. Physics can't really explain or know what dark energy is, and it essentially is a placeholder because observations about the acceleration of the universe did not match what our physics that we know now told us they should be. So we have this kind of placeholder. And it's interesting that energy continues to serve this function, both marking new knowledge, but also marking things that we don't know. Nevertheless, thermodynamics seem to offer a comforting balance with the first law. And I am not an artist, so you have to forgive my PowerPoint graphics here. But the first law tells us that in a system like this, the input should match the outputs, and you can track what kind of work you should get, and then the things that are missing could be coded as waste, and you can maybe make them not escape and do more work. There's also a temporal aspect to this, and unfortunately for humans, there was a second law of thermodynamics, and that's entropy, which says that energy tends to spontaneously diffuse in a system. In other words, it tends to go towards arrangements that have less capacity to do work. A poet like Yeats would say things fall apart. So once a lump of coal is burned, you can't have it back. And if wasted, in the words of Lord Kelvin, who's one of the first discoverers of energy, that potential work is, quote, lost to man irrecoverably. Here we find not only the valorization of work, but also a sense of urgency about it. Because once things like coal, or sunlight falling onto a desert, or water falling over the edge of a waterfall, or wind howling through the plains, once those things move and are not captured, they're wasted. They're lost forever. Some of the leading scientists of energy were based in Glasgow, like Lord Kelvin, and they were Scottish Presbyterians. In Glasgow was the heyday of imperial expansion, shipbuilding, financing American slavery. There was already a veneration for work and productivity in Glasgow, and energy provided a scientific justification for this pre-existing project of putting the world to work for a profit. Work became a site of energy transformation where it could be better tracked and policed. And the measure of civilization, which was always nebulous, became how good you were at this project. So for these men, the sacred, or God, was the only thing exempt from thermodynamics, the only agent that could create energy or protect it from entropic increase. So, as is common with Christianity, this put the sacred outside the earth, separate from the material world. The earth then appears like a tragic, aging thing, subject to entropic increase, waste, chaos, that Anglo-Europeans must try to save by putting it to work. And I think you can still see this language, for example, around solar projects, that there's all this sunlight falling to Earth that we're not using, and we could be. There's still this sense of wastefulness about that. As with dark energy, energy reveals something while showing ever more that it is obscure. Energy science itself doesn't tell humans how to value energy, and even though it suggests a way to count energy in work, that effort would always be impossible. So statistics is actually invented around the birth of energy and the better understanding that energy brought of how heat works. And statistics is invented because you can't, if you have a cylinder of boiling water, you can't actually know the position and movement of every single molecule. So you need these new mathematical tools to approximate them. But the promise that waste and work could be counted was too good to pass up, that there could be better and better and better instruments for accounting. Energy becomes the leading figure in this new theatrics of data. And I call it theatrics because it's a kind of promise of control that's never fully delivered upon. And so we get things like dark energy, the more we need these placeholders for what we don't know. And we're still caught in this theater of data today, where every problem of data is to be solved by more data. And in fact, with dark energy, a lot of scientists say, well, we just need more data to understand what it is. The dominant political economic systems continue to value the growth of production and work, and a specific kind of waged work making commodities over all else. Things that exceed or escape production are invisible and devalued. This means devaluing the very aspects of life that intuitively we all rank highly, like friendship or love, or how beautiful I set a table for a community meal. This is why in the book, and as was said in the introduction, I argue that an energy transition is more than a fuel transition. It's about how we value and organize our activities and even our work. I'd like to conclude today by going back to this idea of immateriality. And I think rather I'd like to introduce a related concept, which is untranslatability. A simple way to say this is that the world is opaque at a fundamental level. Maybe there always will be dark energy. Maybe that's what God is. The world is material, so I kind of, as a materialist, I always want to sort of emphasize materiality, but that doesn't mean it's translatable in our terms or knowable to us. It can't be translated perfectly by our images, our words, our art, especially not our numbers. It can't be, all of our capacities for work and activity cannot be known. That doesn't mean we can't use stories and images and numbers to find out things about the world, but we always have to remember that they're fictive tools, and that's what scientists often, and especially engineers and accountants, tend to forget. Another way to say this is that energy, work, and money can be useful as fictive tools, and it makes sense when they are fetishized. And by fetish, I'm sort of meaning, along with Marx, the sense that they're extra powerful, that there's something beyond them. There's something even semi-religious or mystical about them. Fetishes contain human creativity and social relations, and in particular, commodities do, which is why Marx called them fetishes. And those things are hard to measure, our social relations, but they are palpable. And that's why Marx turned to the realm of religion to kind of describe this feeling that we have about these things. The things we make in exchange seem autonomous because they contain some untranslatable elements of human and social power, maybe energy. Fetishes are probably unavoidable, and I don't think they're necessarily a bad thing. The danger is when these playful fetishes become gods, meaning they become absolute, they become separate, they become beyond contestation. So I'm going to end my remarks there, and I really look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I would like to thank Alex and Rita for bringing me here and to join this very inspiring conversation. I'm an artist, so my talk probably will be more intuitive and very much based on my practice. I come from Uzbekistan, which is in Central Asia. And just to give you a little bit of context so you don't get lost in my talk and in my images, the part of the Central Asia where I come from, it was a part of the Soviet Union. The religion that is practiced is Islam. But in Central Asia, it's quite particular because it's syncretic, which is a combination of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and of course, there is a big influence of Islam, but that all have merged into a very particular practice, which is very influential in my work, in my audiovisual work. Well, reading a concept of Alex and Rita, I was really thinking for a long time, where to direct my talk, because there was so many ways, as each word of your concept speaks to me, and it could be in many ways. But I decided to start from something very practical and simple, and what we can connect in material level, and that what will lead us to immaterial, because that's how it started in my practice. And Aral, fishing in an invisible sea, as you see, the word invisible is already present in my early work, which was made in 2004. It's a documentary film made in the Aral Sea, which is in between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, the sea that has become a desert today. So when I went to document it, it was already gone. So it's a documentary with 4 fishermen, a 4th generation of fishermen that live at the bank of the desert. And like old man has memories, the mid-aged man is trying to survive, and the younger guy that doesn't believe that there was a sea, in fact, So it's a film was based on their lives at the seashore, and I guess the most captivating part of it was the way they perceive their lives on the shore of the sea that exists or doesn't exist. The Aral Sea, it's created by these 2 rivers that flow in the north from the Tian Shan Mountains, in the south from the Pamir Mountains. It's not a sea, it's a very big inland lake, in fact. It was. So when I made this documentary, I got very much interested in the flows itself on the river. So here you can see, this is very basic map, so you can place yourself somewhere, so it can help you. You see where Uzbekistan is. These are the 2 rivers that go to Aral Sea. And we are, in fact, the second, there are 2 landlocked countries in the world. There is Liechtenstein, and then there is Uzbekistan. So for us to get to the sea, we have to cross 2 countries. So water has a very sacred meaning for us. We of course, totally dependent as any human, but we are also very scared of water, of flowing water and water in general. So I start traveling first, just making a travel in Amu Darya in the south part, following the Amu Darya River, the southern. And of course here many questions come out also related to the recent history, to the colonial past, to the Soviet era, because this is the water flow that divides Soviet Union from the influence of British Empire in the past. So this is just for you to see how the sea became desert, so you still can see the boats that are in the middle of the desert, which can be shocking for you. You know, you live at the ocean and the water, yeah. So here, you know, like by speaking with people and spending time and living with them, it actually happens by speaking and living and eating together and observing and getting used to each other. You start entering the dimension which doesn't lay on a first surface, but you are welcomed and they let you get into their, let's say, invisible lives, no? But probably because I was interested in that. So I made the film. It's a 3-channel film installation called Stains of Oxus. Oxus was the name of Amu Darya, a Greek name because the Greeks came to Central Asia. And I have collected dreams of people that live on the seashore of the Amu Darya River. So, because we have this beautiful ritual where we share our dreams with water in the morning. And this was a gateway for me to start entering this immaterial side of Central Asian, let's say, memories, subconscious knowledge, healing knowledge, spiritual dimension. These are the shots from the film. As I said, it's 3 screens, and I went up to the Pamir Mountains, so from the glaciers, it's like around 4,500 meters over the sea level, you know, when the glaciers melt, and then I was following down, down, down. It makes around 2,500 kilometers, right until the Aral Sea again, and just systematically interviewing people, the dreams that they have once shared to the water that they, and it's done normally in the morning. You don't share it with humans. You should share with the water, you know, so it's a very sacred ritual, I think. When I wrote down the interviews, I have stumbled to a next character of my films that came. It was the figure of the Turan tiger. It's a totem figure, and he appeared out of several interviews that suddenly, when you read these dreams, you see how a figure of an animal that has extinct in 1960s, which was considered to be sacred in Central Asia and never hunted, but it was hunted when we got colonized, is bound to a spiritual guide. So when they speak about the tiger, they speak about the healer, a shaman, somebody who insists on the transmission of a knowledge. And if it is not acted or done, the transmission of the knowledge, then the tiger, in fact, brings aggression in the dreams. So a person can get very sick. So you probably know it from shamanism, you know, like the healer gets a burden of sickness, very heavy sickness, before he starts healing. And so this connecting figure between these dimensions and the world is a tiger. And so I started researching about the Turan tiger, and I made a film called The Haunted in 2017. And the more I got to know about the tiger, I have understood that, in fact, the Turan tiger extinct together with the Turkestan. And Turkestan was a territory of Central Asia before the Soviet Union. We were created by the Soviets in 1924. We were split into the 5 republics with not natural borders. And the Turan tiger, just by its title, Turan, means a territory that lays on the north of the Amu Darya. There is Iran and Turan, no? So Iran is a Persian world and Turan is a Turkic world. So I made this film where I have interwoven the recent history of Turkestan, the creation of the republics, and especially Uzbekistan, and the figure of this tiger that insists on transmission of a knowledge that appears in the dreams. And when you listen to these dreams, the beautiful thing that happens is that you don't understand where the reality is or where illusion is. Is it here or it's actually here? But when they tell their dreams, you in fact find yourself somewhere else. And I think that this was a very powerful impact I had, and that's why I made this film in a very, I did it quite fast as a reaction. And I should say also the film made in Uzbek. We speak a Turkic language, the language that have suffered the Soviet period as well, because we are educated in Russian. But for me, it was important that the film is done in Uzbek, where I read this text, and I address to the Turan tiger as a figure, a guide, a totem, asking him to bring back the knowledge that we have unfortunately lost, but not only because of our will, but because of the circumstances of the history. So this is from The Haunted. And while doing The Haunted, again at the shores of the Amudarya River, there is this quite impressive archaeological monument, which doesn't have a lot of attention, it just stands there in the middle of the steppe. You drive one way or the other, you see this mound, but obviously hand-built, it's not natural, which is called Chilpak. And here we come to number 40, Chiltan, Chilpak. Chil is 40 in Persian. And this archaeological monument, it's a tower of silence, what is called, that remains from the Zoroastrian era. When people died, they were given to birds to be eaten. That is still practiced in Tibet, but we used to have it as well because the water is sacred, the fire is sacred, earth is sacred. And so the bodies were given to be eaten by birds, and you climb it, and it's a very special experience to be there. So why I say about 40, during this research as well, I have stumbled, but I knew it like on a very, when you know and you don't know, the presence of the figure of Chiltan, which is 40 sacred bodies. They are shapeshifters, they are non-gender entities. But I have inherited this knowledge more from my grandmother, so it's on my female line, and of course I see it from the feminine perspective. And I have done this work, which is very, very simple. I have invited 40 girls from college, they are teenagers, and we made this travel to the Chilpak Qala, that's how we call it. And I was curious to see how they react. And the condition when they were going, I asked to select the ones that have never been there. And because if they would go there before, they would know how to behave and how to interact with the space. So we were on this mount with these 40 girls, half a day, like from midday to the sunset. And I just let them be, and I stayed with the camera observing their body connection and a relation to the space that has a very specific energy, because it's either you go positive, that's what I had, or you go very negative and heavy, that some of them had, they couldn't stay there long. And so this is a flagstock, which was for a Soviet flag of the Karakalpakstan, which is an autonomous republic in Uzbekistan. And they start, in fact, circling around and putting the fabrics, the ribbons, and it became a very special ritual. Of course, there was a little bit of a direction, like, look at this stone, look at this, and I was curious to see how they react and what they start doing. And in fact, it became a ritual, and they were in it, mentally, spiritually. So we have spent this time, and then when we went back. And then, of course, it was, I asked some of them, like, how would you know how to do it or how to make it, that, like it looked like a pure choreography. There was not a choreography rehearsal. But apparently it works like, well, I've heard that some women come here to make some rituals, but then this information, even if they are not synchronized, agreed, or rehearsed, they work. So it was a communal experience, a tuned communal experience, let's say, where your body reacts to a sacred place. So about Krıkkız and the 40, I will just say a few words because the time is running out. I start making kind of around 5 works with this presence of the Çiltan 40 or Krıkkız. It's actually synonyms because Krıkkız it's in Turkic, in Uzbek, and Çiltan it's in Persian. We use the both languages in parallel. So there are ruins, and I made a performance of 86 minutes with traditional musicians because music, I think, it has this power. It channels something that very difficult to, well, it's intangible, you know, it goes beyond. And I think it encodes a memory, it encodes culture. And again, speaking about the Soviet past, you know, there was a lot of efforts done to retune our musical heritage, but it didn't work. It's still there. So for me, it was very important to work with young female musicians that carry this code in them of traditional music, instrumental and vocal. So I did the Krıkkız. These are the 2 shots from the Krıkkız. Then I made the work called Çilla Hona. Again, Çilla 40 Hona is a room. It's a room of self-isolation where people isolate themselves for the spiritual experience. Mostly when the rational cannot help anymore, you know, when the situation gets critical for many reasons, but there is a rational, it becomes helpless. So the only way to get healed is self-isolation and getting reconnected to your ancestral background, knowledge, and memory. So I have red light blinking. I'm going to stop here. But just 2 words that I did also for document the project with the Çiltan, where I have thought that it's also interesting to embody this idea into characters of today. So I have created a collective with 20 female artists, and then they have invited another 20 artists, so we were 40. And we have presented a work in Documented during 100 days, and it was all focused on ancestral knowledge, on healing experience through the ancestral knowledge. And yeah, thank you.
And I think now we're going to listen to Marie Bardet, who sent us her contribution over video.
Bonjour, bonsoir, bon après-midi, selon le moment où vous vous trouvez en ce moment. C'est un plaisir de participer à vos rencontres. Je remercie énormément l'invitation et je regrette de ne pas pouvoir être présente parmi vous, mais je vous envoie cette vidéo pour vous approcher quelques réflexions ou quelques expériences autour de ces relations entre spiritualité et somatique. Je vais le faire essentiellement, très rapidement, depuis des expériences collectives et des expériences partagées, à la fois des expériences depuis la philosophie, depuis les pratiques somatiques et depuis des pensées transféministes et queer. En particulier, je voudrais apporter quelques points pour penser et pour pouvoir avancer sur une pensée des dimensions spirituelles dans une approche écosomatique telle que nous avons intitulé d'abord des rencontres et puis un livre que nous avons dirigé avec Joanne Clavel et Isabelle Ginot, moins comme un nouveau modèle ou une nouvelle théorie qu'il faudrait appliquer, mais bien plutôt comme une alliance et un tissu issus d'expériences et de pratiques et de pensées à partir des pratiques somatiques, des pratiques de lutte écologique et de lutte féministe. La première chose que je voulais avancer, c'est, il me semble qu'il y a un premier défi qui serait de penser cette spiritualité ou une spiritualité somatique pas trop humaine, pas trop humaine, comme disait Nietzsche, sinon une alliance d'abord qui se barre et qui barre l'opposition entre matérialité et immatérialité que nous héritons dans la pensée occidentale d'un cartésianisme, mais aussi une transversalité qui ouvre et qui inaugure une transversalité avec notre entour ou notre environnement ou notre contexte, et en particulier les autres qu'humains avec lesquels nous cohabitons. Et je crois que c'est un des enjeux les plus à la fois urgents et à la fois les plus difficiles sans doute, mais je crois comme un troisième point pour cette introduction, qu'il y a dernièrement, ou qu'en tout cas autour de moi il y a dans les dernières années, une inquiétude ou un renouveau pour penser et intégrer ces dimensions spirituelles à nos analyses, qui sont des forces pour les penser comme des puissances de transformation, ou pour penser les spiritualités dans des luttes et des transformations. En ce sens-là, je pense en particulier à comment un vieux concept comme celui du principe espérance de Ernst Bloch, qui traverse ses analyses sur la guerre des religions en Europe, en particulier 15e, 16e siècle, est repris plus récemment, enfin tout à fait récemment, par Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, qui fait un croisement entre ses études sociologiques depuis La Paz, Bolivie, et les pensées andines, et croise cela avec l'importance de revenir à une dimension de ce principe espérance, ou d'une certaine, on pourrait dire, spiritualité politique dans des luttes récentes. Et c'est cette alliance entre principe espérance et spiritualité politique, c'était ce que Foucault avait opéré, disons, pendant ses visites en Iran en 1978, et qui lui a valu à son retour, où il parlait d'un principe espérance et d'une dimension de spiritualité politique dans un mouvement insurrectionnel, ce qui lui a valu de forts brimades par une intellectualité de gauche française. Et je propose, nous avons repris ça dans une traduction de ce texte-là de Foucault, Se soulever, qui a d'abord été un entretien avec Fares Sassine, un intellectuel libanais, publié précisément par des danseuses dans la revue Rodeo, et que nous avons repris en espagnol, et sur lequel nous avons publié un petit article avec Verónica Lago. Mais ce qui me semble important dans cette effervescence, ou dans cette émergence des questions spirituelles, en particulier pour penser les insurrections, et en particulier pour penser les insurrections féministes, c'est qu'il y a une certaine manière, une émergence de ce qu'on nous pourrait parler, ou de ce que je propose de penser comme un matérialisme gestuel, ou un matérialisme entre les gestes, qui fondamentalement met en jeu ou remet en cause ou en question cette opposition entre matérialité et immatérialité, pour comprendre y compris la dimension, on va dire, sensible de nos vies. Penser la spiritualité, donc, comme vous le proposez dans ces journées, comme une transversalité ou une continuité, une perspective continue entre matérialité et immatérialité, c'est précisément ce que nous tentons de faire lorsque nous parlons en termes de gestes, plutôt que de penser sur le corps ou du corps. Ces gestes, pour le dire très rapidement, que nous reprenons dans cette perspective écosomatique, sont des gestes en tant que relation au sens radical du terme, c'est-à-dire non pas relation entre des éléments, mais relation de relation, pour reprendre la terminologie de Simondon, et comment cette attention au geste, ou cette attention gestuelle, peut apporter à un courant que nous allons appeler de renouvellement du matérialisme. Penser en termes gestuels comme relationnalité radicale, point important, ce qui ne veut pas dire un relativisme, mais bien une relationnalité, permet d'une certaine manière de ne pas refaire du corps et d'une attention au corps un objet sur lequel nous pensons, mais bien un vecteur d'attention et un vecteur de pensée. Dans ce trajet-là, dans ce trajet écosomatique, je voulais raconter comment nous avons fait alliance de manière assez surprenante et de fait, dans le livre écosomatique, cela apparaît dans l'article de Joanne Clavel, avec un vieux, on va dire, ingénieur agronome, André-Georges Audricourt, qui, dans une perspective qui, lui, ou dans un ancrage qui, dans son cas, était d'un matérialisme, on va dire, dans les années 50-60, y compris une appartenance au Parti communiste, pense ce matérialisme à partir de la culture et des gestes de culture, en particulier des plantes, se forme d'abord en France, puis en Russie, puis va travailler en Asie et en Océanie, et on ressort et on revient ensuite pour enseigner au Muséum d'histoire naturelle. Sa perspective, que l'on pourrait dire d'une attention au geste, d'une attention à ces rapports entre les humains et les autres qu'humains, que sont les plantes et les animaux dans certaines cultures, va établir une perspective transversale, une perspective transversale et dynamique, où il propose de penser en continuité, on va dire, le corps, ses plantes, l'énergie et les outils utilisés. Mais cette perspective va surtout lui permettre d'insister, ou va lui faire insister, en particulier dans un texte de 1962, sur deux aspects que je voulais reprendre ici. Premièrement, la réciprocité, c'est-à-dire que c'est quelqu'un qui va voir dès ce moment-là que étudier les modes de culture de différentes populations ne peut se penser strictement ou de manière absolue en termes de progrès, parce qu'il faut inclure dans cette comparaison entre les sociétés, dit-il, qui est toujours un problème, il faut inclure la réciprocité, en gros l'épuisement des ressources qu'implique le progrès, c'est une sorte d'écologie avant l'heure. Il ne le pose pas en termes écologiques, mais oui en termes de réciprocité transversale. Et de perspective de réciprocité. Et par ailleurs, il inclut dans cette étude des gestes des sociétés qu'il étudie le fait qu'il faut prendre en compte sur un même plan, dit-il, les gestes de culture pour l'alimentation, donc planter le riz, cultiver l'igname, mais aussi ces populations d'Océanie qui parcourent 250 km pour aller chercher une racine hallucinogène pour leur rituel. Cette simple observation de la part d'un ingénieur agronome marxiste de 62 peut nous surprendre, mais surtout peut être récupérée, je crois, comme une invitation et une interpellation à cette dissociation et à ce qu'on appelle matérialisme, et à cette dissociation entre nécessité et désir, ou entre besoins primaires et besoins secondaires. Et il me semble que cette urgence ou cet appel actuel à repenser la question de la spiritualité tout près du corps ou tout près des gestes, au plus près des gestes, est aussi un écho politique à une mise en doute ou une mise en question ou une reformulation de penser les termes, penser des luttes qui prennent en compte les conditions de vie, donc des luttes, on pourrait dire matérialistes, qui se laissent immédiatement interpeller et qui ne reproduisent pas, pour dire autrement, qui ne reproduisent pas cette opposition ou cette distinction a priori entre nécessité et désir, ou besoin primaire et besoin secondaire, ce qui est, soit dit en le disant au passage, ce qui est très souvent les interpellations que dans certains processus politiques, on entend en disant bon, bah, d'abord on va résoudre des problèmes d'habitat, des problèmes de faim, des problèmes d'alimentation, etc. Puis après on verra les questions écologiques et après on verra les questions féministes. Et puis après, bien entendu, comment il y a une progressivité dans les luttes et comment faire des interpellations ou de l'urgence d'une dimension spirituelle qui n'est pas, comme parfois le concevaient certains matérialismes historiques, qui n'est pas simplement entièrement capté ou entièrement saisissable par la religiosité ou par la religion, mais qu'il y a cette prise en compte de certaines dimensions spirituelles. En ce sens, et certainement si pour moi l'urgence de cette dimension spirituelle arrive dans ces derniers temps, dans certains travaux, ou dans certaines pratiques ou dans certains milieux, c'est aussi d'habiter hors d'Europe et d'être fortement interpellé par à la fois des mouvements sociaux, mais aussi des mouvements politiques et des mouvements de pensée, comme indigène et comme en particulier ce que je voulais apporter avec précaution, inquiétude et une certaine émotion, c'est donc les paroles d'une communauté mapuche, Lof Lafken Muikul Mapu, qui précisément a été dans ce cas recueilli après l'assassinat d'un d'eux par les forces armées de l'État argentin, et dans le cadre d'un projet d'un artiste qui s'appelle Dani Selko et qui fait ce projet qui s'appelle Réunion, ou Réunion, donc qui est tout à fait téléchargeable en PDF, qui n'existe pas encore ni en français ni en portugais, mais qui existe en espagnol. Et je voudrais vous lire en particulier une partie du texte, donc pas le texte collectif, c'est un texte transcrit de l'oralité. Le processus de travail de Dani Selko consiste à écouter cette communauté ou à écouter une parole et la retranscrire en revenant à la ligne à chaque fois que la personne prend une respiration, ce qui donne lieu à un texte de cette forme-là. Donc pas le premier texte qui est un texte collectif, mais le texte de Soraya Maiconia, qui est en particulier une chanteuse, qui récupère les chants de la communauté et les rituels. Je prends cette parole-là et je la transmets dans notre rencontre avec la donnée et la précaution et la grande question de l'engagement, de à quoi nous engage de faire passer ces voix et à quoi nous engage la question spirituelle mise au cœur de la question de nos gestes, d'un matérialisme gestuel et de nos écosomatiques, en sachant qu'il y a eu, dans cette communauté-là, qui avait récupéré son territoire, une répression très forte il y a 15 jours, avec l'incarcération de cette femme, dont une femme enceinte qui a dû donner naissance à son enfant sans la possibilité d'avoir que vienne sa partera, sa doula de sa communauté. Donc je prends cette parole et je transmets cette parole avec la question de l'engagement, de à quoi nous engage de transmettre ces paroles et d'accompagner ma transmission de ces paroles de cette communauté, qui est une demande de leur part actuellement de faire connaître leurs pensées, de faire circuler ce livre, avec l'exigence de leur libération immédiate et de la reconnaissance que cette récupération de leur territoire est une récupération urgente, nécessaire et légitime. Je cite donc Soraya. Et je vais faire une traduction sauvage en même temps. Il n'est pas une tâche facile que de reconstruire notre culture et de récupérer nos terres ancestrales, entre autant de répression, de judiciarisation, de prison et d'assassinat. Mais d'une certaine manière difficile à expliquer, une fois que nous avons détecté, que nous avons assumé d'où nous venons, nous n'avons pas d'autre option. Nous n'avons pas d'autre option que d'avancer, de continuer la vie, de continuer notre vie, de continuer à être Mapuche. La confiance pour avancer dans cette reconstruction, nous l'obtenons en commençant à participer à des cérémonies, en tentant de parler un peu notre langue, en cuisinant nos nourritures, en écoutant nos rêves, notre peuma, en récupérant le lawen, entre parenthèses, plante médicinale, les epeu, entre parenthèses, histoire ancienne, en assumant les rôles que chacun a au sein de la communauté et au sein d'une cérémonie. Tout cela nous permet de réveiller cette connaissance ancestrale, et de cette connaissance ancestrale, il n'y a pas de retour en arrière. Dans les 20 dernières années, dans cette zone, à partir du sud de Buenos Aires jusqu'ici, nous assistons à beaucoup de récupération de territoire, et ceci nous indique qu'il y a de plus en plus, cette connaissance est en train de se réveiller, et que c'est pour ça qu'il est nécessaire de revenir à notre territoire. Sur notre territoire, nous cohabitons avec la force de la terre et le ciel, le Wallon Mapu, le tout. Il est important que le territoire soit en équilibre, parce que nous pouvons être en équilibre nous aussi. Et c'est pour cela que nous nous opposons fortement à l'avancée des entreprises extractivistes qui tuent les forêts, qui tuent les arbres, qui tuent la rivière, qui nous condamnent à mort, à une mort sans dignité. Ceci n'est pas un discours environnementaliste, écologiste, ceci est un engagement réel, un engagement de vie que nous assumons, nous, les peuples originaires. Maintenant que nous prenons conscience de qui étaient nos grands-pères, de qui étaient nos grands-mères, et que nous faisons partie de la Terre. Je vais m'arrêter là en redonnant les références du livre que vous pouvez télécharger, tout du moins en espagnol en PDF, et en espérant ou en nous engageant à continuer nos réflexions autour de ces dimensions spirituelles, pas seulement humaines, mais qui nous connectent avec les autres qu'humains et qui intègrent dans nos pratiques somatiques ces engagements aussi à soutenir et faire alliance avec d'autres modes de pensée, non pas pour en extraire une autre saveur pour nos vies trop internétisées ou ennuyeuses, mais bien pour créer de réelles alliances de pensée et de pratique. Je vous remercie énormément de l'attention. Je regrette encore plus de ne pas pouvoir être directement en dialogue. Ce dispositif est vraiment très étrange pour moi. Je m'excuse de la possible difficulté de cette ressource, mais je suis ravie de pouvoir participer et j'espère bientôt échanger. Très bonne continuation de journée. Bonjour.
Force of habit, we think of it as a resource, as a thing, right? A thought that is not so outlandish because energy is actually a word in the substantive. It's a noun. A noun, an object, a cause behind wars and diplomatic alliances, something to extract, divide, lay claim to, possess, blackmail with, principle of appropriation. It energizes us, our bodies, psyches, economies, technologies, political systems. The will to energy is none other than the will to willing, where the objective, is not some inert material, but an active, activating event. And that's where maybe the immateriality of energy arises, from its excess over an object of appropriation that it usually figures as. The crisis of energy is that though treated as a resource to be seized in a mad race with others who desire it, it seizes us. It seizes us first. In other words, it is a concept and a practice constitutively, essentially in crisis, divided against itself. Preceding the wedge that modernity drives between activity and passivity, or subjects and objects, energy breaks out and through every frame we wish to impose on it. And I think Kara's quotes beautifully exemplified this as well, that all the impositions of any frameworks, scientific, philosophical, economic, and so forth, on energy in the end do not succeed. It is therefore divided against itself between its current and ancient significations, its ontic clarity and ontological obscurity, its economic desirability and philosophical marginalization. Now, while associated with actual energy resources or reserves, energy as such has the predominant sense of potentiality, of dynamis, especially nowadays. This goes contrary to the meaning ascribed to it by Aristotle, who coined the term energeia. And by the way, when we say energy or energia or energia in any language, we speak a little Greek here without realizing it. Aristotle thought of energy as not potentiality, or more positively, as actuality. We think of it as dynamis, as not actuality. So our world is Aristotle's world upside down. And all the laws of thermodynamics and so on, and associations of energy with dynamics are precisely against what Aristotle taught us. And dynamis is dynamite. To obtain it, we must extract it, wrest it from others, human or not, animate or inanimate, at the price of their wholeness. Energy extraction tears actual beings, the placeholders of Aristotelian energeia, apart, obscenely laying their entrails bare, enucleating them. Energy production is a fury of destruction. It does not relent until the atom is split, until it reaches the nucleus and divides the ostensibly indivisible. Nuclear power and the atomic energy it unbridles is the apotheosis of the contemporary dogma of energy, the fulfillment of a process forbidding any fulfillment, anathema to everything actual. And so is hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, that cracks the earth, particularly shale rocks, open, by exerting high water pressure from within, from below. Environmentally destructive and shockingly short-sighted as these methods of energy production are, they are to be expected given the dominant conception of energy that requires breaching and laying bare the bedrock of things, of the atom, of the earth, of the body, of the mind, so as to draw power from this violent and violating exposure. And you can see how by putting in the same line the atom, the earth, the body, and the mind, I'm trying to create a continuum between material and immaterial practices of energy that I think all hinge on a particular approach to this thing that we call energy. And so the crisis of energy is at its direst when, enucleating the world, we ourselves are enucleated. Be it labor or truth, we extract value from the universe outside us and from the human, destroying the material shells that enclose the valuable bit of potentiality. Right? So if we have this idea of energy as dynamis, as dynamite, as potentiality, then we would not rest until we extract this valuable bit of potentiality from beings, whether animate or inanimate, human or non-human. And knowledge practices and work practices are on this, once again, on the same continuum here. On the spreadsheets of capitalism, we're accounted for as human resources from which work can be extracted incompatibly with Marx's dream of human self-actualization through labor. Our epistemologies also acquiesce with the ambition to disclose the marrow of reality. We analyze things, break them down into components in our understanding, where mere appearances do not suffice. Thinking has to assume the shape of mental fracking to count as serious thinking. Unless we subscribe to a phenomenological methodology, we are quite dissatisfied with the surface of things, with how they present themselves to us in everyday life, with their imperfections, incompletions, shadowy spots, and badges of finitude, their limits and ends, in other words, their material actuality. For us, superficial actuality, the actuality of the superficies, is never actual enough. As we strive to know what things really are, we break them down to atomic and subatomic, chemical and molecular levels. We analyze them. Why should the style of energy production and extraction be at variance with that of the production and extraction of knowledge or knowledges? The two would have to change in tandem if human impact on the world, as well as on ourselves, is to be mitigated. So against this rather bleak, pessimistic background of what energy production is in all spheres of life today, I sought some hints for an unconventional energy model in the realm of vegetal life, in how plants live, and because this has been my preoccupation, my theoretical concern and practical concern for years, if not decades now. I had noticed in my previous investigations that the energy plants derive from the sun in the process of photosynthesis is non-destructive, world-preserving, and essentially superficial. Could it be that our stubborn denigration of all things vegetal was in collusion with the desire to burn everything and everyone, instead of receiving the bountiful energy of the solar blaze in the matter of vegetation? If so, then we must learn from plants how to live a more ethical life, respectful of the other's claim to existence, and operating with a drastically different energy than the one we're accustomed to. The locution green energy would need to acquire a literal tinge to be truly meaningful. And so plants, to put it very succinctly, need not devastate the interiority of another being to procure their energy. They set to work the elements that they do not control. Plants are essentially synergic, and if our energy models are to change in all domains of life, we would have to learn to identify energy with synergy, with an energy with a working with others, as opposed to against them, right? Besides water and the minerals that plants draw from the soil, they receive what they need from the sun, collecting solar sustenance on their maximally exposed surfaces, the leaves. Human reliance on solar energy would signal our willingness to learn from plants and to accept mutatis mutandis, an essentially superficial existence, or at the very least, to integrate it with a dimension of depth. Although current technical capabilities would sustain a nearly total reliance on renewable energy, which I prefer to call elemental energy, and I will finish by reflecting a little bit with you on the meaning of the term renewable. Although these capacities exist, they're extraneous to the prevalent mindset regarding the essence of energy, viewed as something destructive, extractive, to be snatched from the interiority of things. The focus of attention may actually swing to clean energy, and that is in and of itself laudable. But cleanness relates primarily to the effects of utilization, not to the question of what energy is. That is why oil, coal, and most of all natural gas companies can boast that they are making the transition to clean energy without radically modifying the sources of fuel themselves, let alone how they are procured. And so, to conclude in the remaining time, I would like to reflect a little bit on this concept of renewability, which has become a little bit of a dogma in the green energy transition. And once again, I'm not entirely comfortable with this concept, and I would like to replace it with what I propose to call elemental energy as opposed to renewable. In the best of scenarios, when its loss is not altogether ignored, biological life is mourned only when it is not replaced, or rather not replaceable. So renewable energy tells us that when we're using in this category, let's say, plants that are cultivated and burned for no other purpose than to procure biodiesel or biofuel, that these vegetal lives are not mournable because they can be replaced by other plants. They are renewable. The psychological weight of mass extinction balances on or falls with the replaceability and the irreplaceability of the lost species. Yet even here, mourned irreplaceability is diluted and reintegrated into the logic of the dominant system of thinking and acting through suggestions to create genetic data banks, the DNA archives of endangered species that can be resurrected from the stored blueprint of their basic makeup at will. Reproducibility as a variation on the theme of renewability stops real changes in their tracks. So the classification of biofuels, for instance, ethanol distilled from sugarcane or biodiesel derived from soybean oil as renewable sources of energy, alongside solar, hydro, and other elemental energy alternatives, makes little sense. It lumps together plants grown to be burnt en masse as biodiesels and our cooperation or cohabitation with the elements of water, air, and solar fire. Why? We may detect a close link to the potentiality at the heart of energy in renewables. The renewability of the burnt elevates this mode of energy production to an ideal that this corresponds to. So I would claim that this focus on renewable energy does not radically depart from the sense of energy as a potentiality. Renewability is, in fact, a sleight of hand through which the old is rendered new again, renewed or renovated, rejuvenated or reinvigorated, and above all marked by the possibility of potentially infinite reinvigorations in a future that is supposed to be indefinitely repeated. Renewability is replaceability that overcomes time constraints, that substitutes for an aging, an old, or a dying, or a dead being, a new version of that being, as though old age and death had no effect. It is more than the replacement of one being with another, the replacement of this being with the possibility of this being, inexhaustible in the existence of particular beings. Right? So with renewability, we are purely in the realm of potentiality that energy has been identified with, and incapable of mourning the loss of lives of concrete beings, whether human or not, that this notion of renewability promises. Renewability is also utterly mired in the logic of resources with which we started this reflection. Insofar as whatever or whoever is renewable is restocked without any glitches or delays, the storehouse of nature continually filled with fresh supplies of the same. The possibility that seduces us is not even existential. It is not ensconced in the finitude of actual existence, but is unfastened, is untied from the finite as finite, and made fit for the ledgers that, besides keeping track of the current stockpiles of raw materials, energy resources, and so forth, prognosticate their steady abundance. Renewability bets on the reproducibility of life as the foundation for the replaceability of the living, a highly unethical stance, of course, once we articulate it in this sense. Conversely, finitude implies, far from the secular ideology of the end of times and universal damnation, the possibility of life's reinvention as opposed to its reproduction amidst the planetary trauma of extinction and exhaustion. A finite energy, the energy of finitude, is sorely missing, and I'm hoping very much that our discussions of immaterial energy touch upon a finite energy, an energy that is ebbing away as a life that is finite, as a body that is aging and approaching its death. But a finite energy, the energy of finitude, is sorely missing at the level of our collective imagination, if not of actual existence, with which it seamlessly merges. And I think this could lead up to our discussion. Yeah, thank you.
So we have 20 minutes, half an hour to discuss. I wanted to give the word to you in order to put your questions. We have our own, but I think it would be also important to give space to discuss. Even Kara and Sauda and Michael that heard each other, each presentation. I don't know if you want also to address some questions. Or we can start.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of synergy kind of stick to me right now, and I was curious because I think it resonates with the three of your presentations and also with Marie, in the sense of how to strengthen this sense of dependency on the one hand, but also how to not only be independent with others, but wanting to be with others. This idea of finitude that you describe and renewability as a form of just thinking energy and resources as an infinite means, and how to go back, if it's possible at all, or where this kind of inertia to live and to inhabit energy in that sense, and how can we create a sense of wanting to be with others, not only in a theoretical sense, but also how to re-enchant this possibility.
I'll venture, and it's been lovely to hear all your conversations, and I love the ending with the question of finitude and desire. So a lot of my recent work on the contemporary politics of energy is about this fact that dependency is a bad thing for our current economic logic, or even our notion of freedom is about beyond limits. So it's one thing for environmentalist or ecological politics to pose that we have to have limits. And I think, as you're talking about, it's another thing to create this imaginary, whether it's vegetal or these other imaginaries through which we could desire dependency and desire limit. And so for me, that's why I turned to feminist thought, because I think a lot of the fear of dependency comes from hierarchical power structures where it's extractive. And so I think dependency is scary when we're living in an extractive system, because you can't count on each other. And it's kind of a sense that there's nothing to catch you. And so I think a lot of feminists right now are thinking about infrastructural politics, for example, or really about, to me, it's about building systems and worlds that make dependency desirable, or that make dependency something that you could accept and then count on others to care for you. And I think it's kind of a chicken and egg problem, if that translates, speaking of translatability, in the sense of like, you can't desire something if you don't yet have an infrastructure that supports it. And yet, how do we mobilize to build an infrastructure if we don't really desire it? So I don't know if I have the answer, but that's where I'm personally thinking.
Yes. I think that it's true that in many of the practical discourses surrounding energy, there is this ideal of energy independence. In fact, this is one of the keywords of American energy policy, and in Europe we are also getting into an idea of energy independence, clearly because of the current war that Russia is waging on Ukraine, and the idea behind energy independence is a kind of self-sufficiency, right? It's still the old idea of a self-sufficient individual, but now magnified to the level of a nation or a political community as such. And of course, what we're talking about is not necessarily dependence as the underside of this, but a positively reevaluated notion of dependence, where I would even prefer the idea of an encounter. Where do encounters like this one, for instance, but also encounters that define our experiences as living beings, where do they happen? They always happen at the limits of our bodies, at the limits of our thinking, at the limits of our senses, and in the interfaces with other beings, whether human or not. And so this more positive notion of dependence would be, or interdependence in that sense, would for me be correlative to meeting at the limits, precisely at the finite borders of ourselves that are repressed and suppressed behind all of these ideas of self-sufficiency or energy independence, or renewables where limits are constantly negated. They are recognized and negated at the same time. In psychoanalysis, the technical term is disavowal, right? You acknowledge something, but you immediately repudiate it, right? And so renewability is that. We acknowledge that these beings are finite, the resources are finite, but they, despite their finitude, they can, in their possibility of being, be brought back into existence, right? And I think it's time not only to reinvent a more positive notion of dependence or interdependence, but also to deal really in depth with this disavowal of finitude, and to reinvent finitude and our limits and edges as the places where encounters happen, where everything actually takes place. Yeah.
I have a question for Saudat, but related to what Marie Bardet was saying. But first, I wanted also to ask to Kara, because in the Birth of Energy, you speak about energy also has a kind of theology, and you put this question historically related with the idea of work. So the human body as a source of energy, of a resource, as Michael was saying. So I don't know if you wanted, I would love to listen a little more about this relation between energy and labor, or energy and work. And
when I started thinking about energy, although I had taken advanced physics and I thought I knew a lot about thermodynamics, I really didn't know that it was going to be a book about work, essentially. It became very clear quickly that that's what this modern scientific notion of energy was about for the first scientists. And again, it was about, they're really interested in coal-fired steam engines. So the theological aspect was also something that just emerged out of looking at the historical material. This is a time period, so the same decade that thermodynamics emerges, in those same couple decades is also when evolution as a science explodes upon the world. And theologically, that's important because obviously we all know that in Western society, evolution continues to be really provocative for some, especially more conservative Christians. And so what energy meant to some of these first leading scientists of energy was actually a way that God could be folded into an understanding of the cosmos. And it was a little more friendly to that than evolution was. And I sort of gestured to it, but essentially we left a kind of Enlightenment notion of nature as this balanced, harmonious backdrop that's relatively stable, against which humans have their history out in front on the major players of the scene. Now we get back to almost a Lucretian kind of tragic earth that, but in this Christian doctrine was a fallen, kind of flawed thing that if it wasn't worked on and improved was going to end in heat death, which is actually still a theory in physics, that eventually one end of the universe is going to be that everything, entropy kind of makes us all into this equilibrium state. So this isn't all scientists of energy, but certainly it was a dominant theme, and I think it fed into then the sort of very Protestant dimension of imperial capitalism. And I think it's still with us today. Also, and by us, I mean American energy studies is one place you can find it. So it seems very quantitative and rational
and yet behind it, there are these assumptions going on about value that are really not ever acknowledged.
Thank you.
I think it's interesting to reflect on this idea of work as whether it's material or immaterial labor, but also as an inherent term that speaks of transformation, material transformation, whether it's human beings taking matter and doing something with that matter, industrial, craft, whatever, or transitioning ideas or speculative linguistic labor into the world and doing something out of this. But what we are trying to kind of imagine with this program is also what is this other possibility of immateriality also as action, like trying not to reduce action as acting upon the material world, but also trying to imagine immateriality as a way of acting upon reality or the world or life and so on. So I think in along these lines, the film that Saudat presented to us and the research group is a very inspiring way of dealing with first the presence or the people that are no longer with us and what is their voice now, their immaterial voice, and how this transgenerational knowledge or actions, things that we learn from the past, things that we carry on our bodies and our memories, still has a presence and still has an impact on the material world. So I would love to hear a bit more. How was this experience with these people and with these spirits as well?
Oh. Yes, I think it's fine also. Yeah. Well, I think that there is something very basic related to our emotions, how our emotions work when we research or connect to ancestral knowledge, no? Because it immediately has this nostalgic power that we. It can be quite sometimes unexpected where it can take you. But what it definitely has, it has a very strong impact on emotion. And working with the ancestral knowledge, especially for the document and with this young female artist was crucial for me because, as you have seen in the presentation, that's how my practice is built. And that's where the creative energy comes and inspiration. So by putting together this collective, again, it's about the collectivity and about sharing and talking and trying to find the bridges, but also crossing on the emotional sense. That was, we can also call what happened in document, it was kind of incubation, or it was also a processual and transformative experience. And presenting and bringing this young female artist to document it was not about immediately showing the result, but it was clearly a processual experience, and that was what was important. And this processual experience, I didn't know where it would take us, but it was important that we leave this a period together in Kassel. You know, the space was underground. This was very important for me as well. You know, like when you are not physically related to sunlight, whether you are isolated by sunlight and where you are isolated by everyday routine sounds. So that helps you involuntary to tune slightly different. You tune yourself. And but then if it was more structural, because you cannot go only intuitively or emotionally. You need certain structures and schemes so that this processual experience happens. And in fact, we tried to work we created performances, but based on reading certain written resources, but also we did some, let's say, moments that are related to memory excavation, let's say, you know, and working with the memory and how we excavate the memory through. It's also a non-rational process. It very much works with senses, through smell. I think touches, you know, that really can take you quite deep in the work of a memory, but also always with a focus on ancestral memory, because of course memories can also be harmful and heavy. You know, it was not a psychoanalytical process, but it was really focused on how we can build this space where we get united together and somehow protected by this ancestral knowledge. So that was the main concept of us being in Documenta. Again, it was not about presenting and bringing their practices and sharing with the audience, but it was more about living there and going through a transformation. So that was the major focus of this idea of Chilton, which is, again, I will remind, it's these entities that are known in Central Asia in healing rituals. Scholars call them shamanic rituals, but I would just limit by healing rituals because it can be defined in many other understandings. What was also fascinating, that they are non-gender entities, you know, so they are not limited to a gender, they are shapeshifters, you know, they can be presented as trees, minerals, stones, water bodies, and so in fact it really takes you to the source of life, you know. Yeah.
Just maybe a small footnote on this word work at the heart of energy. Of course, it's there already in Aristotle, because energia, as I hinted at, is a composite word that has ergon as its root, which is the Greek for work, but it's not precisely just work. I translate it into English literally as enworkment, or as a putting to work, you could say, an activation. But at the same time, we cannot really suppose that we know exactly what we're talking about when we say this word work. We have all kinds of associations with it that are productive or reproductive associations, where work aims at generating a certain product outside of itself. But if we think about performativity, for instance, as a kind of work whereby the only outcome is the performer, or the body of the performer, whether human or not, that body itself, then this is another kind of work, another activation, another energy at play. And to touch upon the more theological dimension, of course, both in Western and in Eastern Christianity, there have been speculations about divine energies and what the energy of God would be, because clearly in the process of creation, it seems to be a kind of 6-day work process whereby the world is being produced through divine exercise of energy. But then the 7th day, as the day of rest, is not the day of non-work or an absence of energy. In fact, it's understood as the highest energy, because this is what God is in and of himself or itself or herself, right? It is not creating something outside, but rather being in this state where passivity and activity no longer are differentiated from one another. And this could be the highest energetic state, in fact, that has been then translated into the human realm as the ideal of the Sabbath of man, right? The Sabbath of man, or even the end of history in its more utopian dimension, would be precisely this: at the end of the terrible process of work and suffering that human history is viewed as, at the end there would not be a disaster in the end of the world in the sense in which we're expecting it now apocalyptically, but in the sense of a kind of rest in the fullness of that achievement, but a rest that is the highest of energies, whereby actualization is freed to its own capacities.
If I could, I just really quickly wanted to say, that's why I so appreciated your call to not think reproduction, because I've been troubled by that term. Inspired by it. Feminist thought about work is about how reproduction is not valued. And so a lot of calls are very much about valuing care work. But there's something still very productivist about trying to include care activity into this notion of labor. And I think you used reinvention, which is very similar to what I've been thinking about, creativity together, like collective relations that we make together, is maybe a better thing to aspire to that leaves behind productivism, which is really the problem. But the thing is, we also have to leave behind the desire to count and improve and increase creativity, because then we get back in, you can't, how do you measure it? You can't. Or it's an aesthetic judgment, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that we'll go just one very quick note that the idea of gender appears as very much attached through all of you speak of petromasculinities in the birth of energy and thinking of a new feminist way of inhabiting energy. The sultans are either non-gender or female entities, but they're not male entities. And when you research and speak about the practice and thinking of Hildegard of Bingen, this idea of being a female thinker, quite autobiographical work, this idea of radical empathy to the elements, and it's kind of crossed by her own body and by her own gender identity. So yeah, I just wanted to point out to this as a quite important, and maybe now we can open to the public. I think there is one question, and maybe we can come back.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to change completely the level of discussion, and apologies for it. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. I just have a comment for Michael. It's first a question. Do you consider solar and wind to be fairly called renewable?
No, I protest against the very category of renewables,
yes,
because in this category there is a kind of lumping together of what I call elemental energies, solar, wind, and so on, and energy derived through highly environmentally destructive practices of growing monocultures of crops, burning them, and then distilling alcohol or diesel out of them and then burning that again, right?
Exactly, called biofuel. I think most people know about it.
Yes, exactly.
There is also several activist movements fighting to redefine that to be renewable energy. The reason why I'm saying this is not to be pedantic, to correct you, but because it's really, I know we can spend hours talking about language, and it's really important that we agree upon a language for action. So it would be really tragic, I think, if anybody would leave this room thinking that renewable energy is a bad thing, yeah?
No,
because we still are not having renewable energies, yeah?
Yes.
It's really, really, really important that people understand that, yeah? And then we can all go back into a room and say, but I think it should be elemental, this, that, and the other. So we should come out here thinking it's really problematic. Biofuel is a horrendous thing, and it's highly problematic that it's being considered renewable.
Yes.
That's a fight we need to have. But that's all I wanted to be clear.
Absolutely. And to add to this, I would say, and this is what I write in my recent book, Dump Philosophy, A Phenomenology of Devastation, that the very category of renewable energy is a kind of dump category that contains or brings together a number of things that are very disparate and have nothing to do with one another, like elementals and this energy derived from growing plants and then burning them en masse.
And just a final remark on the language level is a question for the curators. Why did you call this inner extractivism? Because then again, extractivism is a really dirty word, yeah? So, but what was your kind of twist?
Thank you for the question. It's a good question. When we thought of this concept of inner extractivism, is related to this idea of self-alienation, this idea of how extraction and our relation to Earth does not only extract the resources, the mountains, the rivers, and so on, but also ourselves, our minds, our bodies, our souls, if you want. So yeah, this is where it comes from.
It's a bit ambiguous. The polarity of the that's really unclear.
What was the doubt?
Because when I read that title, I don't know whether you're aiming to say that if we entangle spiritual, embodied, if we get spiritual embodiment and energy entanglements, you're calling that inner extractivism and you're giving it like a good, positive value.
No. On the contrary, it's just thinking of them together and thinking the impossibility of imagining extractivism. Otherwise, they all come together. That's what we are trying to point to.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'll preface this by saying I'm a big fan of solar and wind. However, I spend a lot of my time with policymakers who want it to be as simple as adding solar panels. And so I have to push back a little bit and say that we should all leave the room and want solar and wind, but that alone is not going to address the problem of energy additions. So these are not substituting out for fossil fuels. It doesn't solve the problem of energy justice, that many people need more energy, and we simply cannot accumulate all this excess energy at the top. We have to address that problem. And when I tell policymakers this, like just 2 weeks ago, the government of Luxembourg told me, oh, this is impractical. I mean, what they want is to say, solar is great. We just had new solar panels. So I just wanted to complicate what you said because I think it's important to ask these questions and notice this dump term of renewables, which is doing a lot of political work to say technology will save us and we don't have to address these underlying injustices.
Yeah. I can. Okay, he's here.
Oh, hi. Good afternoon, and thank you for the amazing explanation each one gave us. Since 1977, we have that very controversial paper that brings to the table the question, is the roots of our ecological problems are religious? The historical roots of our ecological problem is based on religion, right, written by Lynn White. And because everybody here talk about epistemologies, ontologies, and other things. And nowadays, when we have some reports about living with some communities and their cosmovisions, and for instance, when Pope released encyclical Laudato Si, or when United Nations created 2017 an initiative called Faith for Earth to reunite the biggest religions of the world to bring their faiths and their worldviews together to think about the ecological problem. I ask for someone who wants to answer it, or if no one wants to answer, okay. Can it be discussed in a religious field our ecological problem? May it be a way? Because me, for instance, I'm from Brazil, and as we see, Brazil is taken by neo-Pentecostal churches that are together with Bolsonaro destroying Amazonia, because they put on their cars a sort of stick called "Foi Deus quem me deu," God gave it to me. Okay? So how can productive be a sort of return to religion or to some cosmovisions inside the religions, and even inside the science, a sort of trying to re-enchant the mechanical world? Thank you, and I'm sorry if I sound a little bit crazy.
Yeah, no, this is a wonderful question, and I think you are absolutely right to pinpoint the religious underpinnings of many of the ecological problems. And here we have to be a little careful, not simply saying that the religions predominant in the West, Judeo-Christianity, are at fault. Even though, of course, the predominant version of Judeo-Christianity is to blame for many of these things. I think looking a little deeper, we see that the problem is precisely a separation of matter from spirit. If you think that spirit is completely separate from matter, then no matter what you do to this material world here below is acceptable, because you are not hurting, you are not harming spiritual realities, right? And in fact, and if you think that salvation is in the world of spirit, in the world of pure spirit, you can just destroy the physical world here below, and nothing would happen. And in fact, this is true for the predominant version of Judeo-Christianity, marked by a certain Gnosticism, right? Because if we go back in history, the Gnostics postulate this absolute kind of gap between matter and spirit, and in fact for them death is the true moment of birth, because by dying to this world, this imperfect bodily world, we are born into the true reality of spirit, right? And then you can simply throw away this world as a piece of tissue, used tissue, because of this. But on the other hand, of course, you cited other cosmovisions, indigenous, for instance, cosmovisions that do not at all have this idea. And even within Judeo-Christianity, or the three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the streams that are a little bit subordinated, or that are marginalized compared to the dominant version, mystical streams, actually postulate the unity of matter and spirit. This is why I'm extremely interested in the mystical traditions in the three monotheistic religions, precisely as an alternative vision of how the world would be if even the West were to follow this kind of alternative mystical vision, right? That's one of the reasons why I wrote the book on Saint Hildegard of Bingen, a great Christian mystic thinker. Because if we imagine, what if cues were taken from Saint Hildegard and not from Saint Thomas Aquinas with his hierarchies and so on, then we would have a completely different reality, historical reality, in the West and probably elsewhere where Western influence has extended.
And if I can add, I love this question, and I wish I had a picture of that bumper sticker. That's what we would call it, bumper sticker. God gave it to us, because that is very similar language actually to the first scientists of energy. Like, this is a gift. This knowledge is a gift. But although I've slung a lot of mud at Protestant Christianity, I want to say that another problem is that secularism is not acknowledged as having theological dimensions, and I think it very much does. And I might even say that's really the theological problem, is the extent to which commodities and money are sacred. And I didn't have enough time to really get into this at the end, but to me, what we might do is recuperate the notion of a fetish as sort of thinking more creatively with what kind of power does money have in commodities. If it feels to us that it has this, we're drawn to them, but that's why I go back to Marx, who really says the reason that we're drawn to them is that they're capturing this value of human relations in them, but then we sort of imagine that the thing itself is that which we have a relation with instead of each other. And so I think the problem with science, that there's certain kinds of engineering and science and accounting that really are so data-driven, is again the absolutism of these fetishes, that they really are just reflections of reality, as opposed to these playful objects that in different ways we acknowledge as representing our creativity. And that might be a way to kind of, maybe just starting from the fact that we do have a religion and it's capitalism, and even among our, yes, it's our, well, secularism is maybe a kind of religion.
I will just add through a couple of words. Like again about the Chiltan, bringing these female artists together, we have focused on pre-Islamic traditions. And I think that it crosses here because the pre-Islamic religions in Central Asia are kept by female community. And, the mosques are, only men go to the mosques, so they are more in Orthodox Islam, while women, by not going and by not being accepted to go to the mosque in Central Asia, they have kept in more sacred and intimate rituals that are seen as primitive and, they are not taken seriously. But for me, the code is there, So these practices, these beliefs, they're definitely pre-Islamic because, again, they are more related to our environment, to the way the moon moves, to the way the cosmic language speaks to us, where the time breaks, where you lose the sense of past or future and you find yourself in present by embracing all the time now, And so for me, that's the gate, like to go through this female knowledge that has been carefully passed by from generation to generation and luckily has been saved away from the dominant religion. And I think that this is the knowledge that can offer alternative and it really at least brings a doubt to values, like where is the right value, and I think that this is important.
Thank you. There are no time for a very quick one. Yes. They are giving signs to, I don't know. I'm so sorry. Just one more, okay. It's a very good sign, but time is...
Thank you. I want to thank you all and invite a short reflection. I hope it's not an extra burden on communication because you all hinged on that. Michael, with the communication between finite or in the spaces of finitude, let's say, and also on communication between beings and dimensions, either time dimensions or other. It brings back Cage's poem on overpopulation in art. It says, now that the living outnumber the dead, what does it do to communication? And it feels like eco-poets are giving an answer to this. They start from unintelligibility. So I would like to invite you all to think a bit about communication. Thank you.
So just to say that now we have an hour to to go through the building and through the garden, with where the installations of Mimosa Card, Lourdes Castro, Sun Ra, Suni, Falzer, Martin Lavaneras, Denise Ferreira da Silva, and so this is a moment to also to be with these works, and a lot of the artists are also with us today here. And at 8 o'clock in the evening, we'll have a landscape, a sonic landscape from raw forest. It will be in the museum cafeteria in the Esplanade, so we are very welcome. And tomorrow we restart at 4 for a walk and conversation with Vladimir Jurovic and Paulo Cortreal. And at 5 o'clock, here again, we will have another conversation with Emmanuel Cosia, with Vladimir Jurovic, Felipe de Castro Guerreiro, and Paulo Cortreal. So thank you so much for having been with us for this moment, and look to see you later or tomorrow or even Sunday. Thank you so much.